a cigarette, discarded on a sidewalk, picked up by federal agents who had been watching a man for weeks. That single piece of trash contained the answer to a question Cloverdale, California had been asking for 44 years. The victim was 13. The case was, in the words of the district attorney who finally closed it, the coldest case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury. Welcome to True Crime Files Decoded. This channel investigates real cold cases, the investigations, the forensic breakthroughs, and the legal proceedings that finally brought answers to families who waited years, sometimes decades, for the truth. Subscribe, hit the like button, and drop a comment below with the case you want decoded next. Let us begin. Sarah Ann Geer was 13 years old. She was a 7th grade student at Washington School in Cloverdale, a small town at the northern end of Sonoma County, California. She had been raised by her mother. At the time investigators finally identified her killer, more than 4 decades later, it was an uncle who was notified. Her mother had since died. In 1982, Cloverdale was the kind of place where, in the words of one local newspaper account written decades later, doors were left unlocked and children could walk around alone at night. To the recollection of local police at the time, no homicide had ever occurred in the town before. That changed on the weekend of the 22nd and 23rd of May 1982. Sarah spent that weekend with friends, including a trip to nearby Santa Rosa. On the evening of Sunday the 23rd of May, she returned to Cloverdale. Rather than going home, she continued into town. She stopped briefly at the home of her best friend, Cheryl Evans, on North Cloverdale Boulevard, arriving around 11 in the evening. Evans would later testify that Sarah left roughly 30 minutes later and that nothing about her seemed out of the ordinary. Sarah was last seen at a video game arcade on Cloverdale Boulevard. According to evidence later presented in court, Sarah was approached near an alley off a residential street as she walked. She was taken to a secluded area adjacent to an apartment building, behind a fence. She was sexually assaulted. She died from injuries consistent with strangulation. A former Cloverdale resident whose window faced the alley later testified that she heard movement around midnight and found Sarah's sandals the following morning. Sarah's body was discovered the morning of the 24th of May, 1982, behind an apartment building on Main Street in an alley between 2nd and 3rd Streets. The first people to encounter the scene were children playing in a nearby backyard, including a 6-year-old girl whose grandmother served on the Cloverdale City Council. The children initially believed they had encountered someone sleeping outdoors. From a second-floor vantage point, it became clear that this was not the case. A Cloverdale firefighter, flagged down by a resident while walking home from his shift, formally reported what had been found. An autopsy determined that Sarah Ann Geer, 13 years old, had died from injuries consistent with strangulation. Investigators collected biological evidence from her body and clothing at the scene, evidence that would not become useful for another 21 years, and would not identify a suspect for another 42. She is the only child victim referenced in this case file. No further detail regarding the circumstances of her death will be provided beyond what is necessary to document the investigation and legal proceedings that followed. The Cloverdale Police Department opened a homicide investigation immediately. Retired Officer Lawrence Pena, who was 84 years old when he testified decades later at a preliminary hearing, stated that he had personally interviewed a man named James Unick shortly after the killing in 1982. Pena described the interview as brief and described Unick's manner as cooperative. Unick told Pena he had been with friends that evening. No one verified that account at the time. Pena testified decades later that there had been nothing in the interview to suggest further investigation was warranted and no evidence at the time to indicate a follow-up was necessary. Approximately 9 men were questioned in connection with the case during the original 1982 investigation. According to a local newspaper report from June of that year, a psychic was consulted as part of the investigative effort, reflecting both the seriousness with which the department treated the case and the limited forensic tools available at the time. The case became difficult to advance, complicated in part by what one later news account described as unreliable witness statements. Without the forensic capability to definitively identify a suspect from physical evidence, the investigation stalled. Sarah Ann Geer's case went cold. It would remain cold for 39 years before a formal reinvestigation began, and 42 years before an arrest was made. In 2003, 21 years after Sarah's death, a criminalist with the California Department of Justice developed a male DNA profile from biological material recovered from evidence collected at the scene in 1982, including items of Sarah's clothing. This was a meaningful forensic achievement. Successfully extracting a usable genetic profile from evidence that had been collected and stored for more than 2 decades required forensic techniques that had only recently matured. The development of polymerase chain reaction-based DNA typing in the years prior to 2003 had made it possible to work with smaller and more degraded biological samples than earlier methods allowed. The profile was searched against the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national law enforcement database maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which compares unknown crime scene profiles against the profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees across the country. No match was returned. The person responsible for Sarah Ann Geer's death had no prior criminal record that had generated a DNA profile anywhere in the system. The profile existed, it was complete and viable. It identified no one. The case remained open, but without further investigative direction, it stayed cold for another 18 years. In July of 2021, then Cloverdale Police Chief Jason Ferguson formally reopened the investigation into Sarah Ann Geer's death. The department had reportedly been in communication with a private investigation firm since late 2019, with the intention of revisiting the case using investigative techniques that had not existed at the time of the original crime. Chief Ferguson retired in December of 2023. His successor, Chief Chris Parker, continued the reinvestigation alongside Cloverdale detective Katie Vanoni. Central to this renewed effort was Kevin Klein, a private investigator and president of Klein Investigations, a Northern California firm. Klein is a medically retired California law enforcement officer who transitioned into private investigative work. From July of 2021 to July of 2024, Klein coordinated and led the cold case investigation alongside the Cloverdale Police Department. The investigative team enlisted the assistance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation to pursue a new approach to the 2003 DNA profile, one that did not depend on the unidentified contributor having a prior criminal record. The technique applied to the Geer case is known as investigative genetic genealogy. Rather than searching for an exact match to a known offender, as CODIS does, this method uses publicly available genealogical databases, platforms where individuals voluntarily upload their own DNA results to research family history, to identify biological relatives of an unknown crime scene DNA contributor. When a partial match to a relative is found, genealogical researchers construct family trees extending outward from that match, using public records including birth records and historical documents to progressively narrow the field of candidates until a specific individual can be identified as the likely source of the evidence. This technique gained widespread recognition following its use in identifying the Golden State Killer in April of 2018, a case that had similarly remained unsolved for decades using conventional methods. That success demonstrated the technique's capability with old, degraded crime scene evidence and led to its broader adoption by law enforcement agencies across California. Applied to the Sarah Ann Geer case, the genealogical analysis conducted with FBI assistance concluded that the source of the DNA evidence collected in 1982 belonged to one of 4 brothers, among them James Unick, the same man retired Officer Lawrence Pina had briefly interviewed in 1982. This was not yet confirmation, it was a direction, narrowed from an unlimited population to 4 specific individuals. Several of Unick's siblings were subsequently examined and ruled out as the source of the evidence. With the investigation now focused specifically on James Unick, FBI agents conducted surveillance of him. During that surveillance, agents recovered a cigarette he had discarded, a routine act of littering that became the most significant piece of evidence in the case. DNA extracted from the discarded cigarette was compared in the laboratory against the profile developed in 2003 from the original crime scene evidence. The comparison confirmed a match. Cloverdale Police Chief Chris Parker described the statistical strength of the match publicly, stating that the odds of the match occurring by chance were placed at 630 trillion to 1. In June of 2024, investigators approached Unick directly and obtained an additional saliva sample for confirmatory testing. Unick maintained at that time that he did not know Sarah Ann Geer and had no connection to her case. The Cloverdale Police Department arrested James Oliver Unick on the 22nd of July, 2024, at his residence in Willows, the county seat of Glenn County, located approximately 120 miles north of Cloverdale. Booking records list Unick's age at arrest as 62. He would have been approximately 22 years old at the time of Sarah Ann Geer's death in 1982. He was booked on charges of murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under the age of 14 by force. He was held without bail. At the time of his arrest, Unick denied ever knowing Sarah Ann Geer or having any recollection connected to the 23rd of May, 1982. Cloverdale Police Chief Chris Parker addressed the arrest publicly. Today represents a bittersweet victory for justice. While nothing can undo the pain inflicted upon the Geer family and our community, we can finally offer some solace in knowing that the perpetrator will be held accountable. Cloverdale Mayor Todd Lands also issued a public statement. Today, we stand united in solidarity with the Geer family as we witness the culmination of years of hard work and perseverance by our law enforcement officials. The investigation that led to Unick's arrest involved coordination across multiple agencies: the Cloverdale Police Department, the Glenn County Sheriff's Office, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a private forensic laboratory, the Sonoma County District Attorney's Office, the California Department of Justice, and private investigator Kevin Klein. James Unick made his first court appearance on the 24th of July, 2024, before Judge Laura Passalia in Sonoma County Superior Court. The Sonoma County District Attorney's Office charged him with one count of murder, with enhancement allegations including lewd and lascivious acts on a child and kidnapping. He was represented by defense attorney Gabriel Quinnen. A preliminary hearing was held over 2 days in January of 2025. 6 witnesses testified, including retired officer Lawrence Pina and California Department of Justice senior criminalist Sarah Calvin, who testified regarding the DNA evidence recovered from Sarah Ann Geer's underwear and a tampon found at the scene in 1982. Following the preliminary hearing, Judge Passalia found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Unick entered a plea of not guilty. The trial of James Oliver Unick took approximately 1 month and was held in Sonoma County Superior Court before Judge Laura Passalia, beginning in late January of 2026. The jury that ultimately decided the case consisted of 6 men and 6 women, with alternate jurors bringing the total seated panel to 7 men and 9 women. The prosecution was led by Deputy District Attorneys Christina Stevens and Alex Fisher, with assistance from District Attorney Investigator Dave Call. The prosecution's case centered on the DNA evidence connecting Unick to the crime scene, supported by testimony establishing the timeline of Sarah's final hours and testimony from her childhood friends, none of whom indicated any prior connection between Sarah and James Unick. In her closing argument, Deputy District Attorney Stevens displayed crime scene photography for the jury and stated, "This is what sexual assault looks like. This is what rape looks like." She argued that Unick's account of the timeline was inconsistent with where Sarah was known to have been that evening, and she characterized Unick's testimony as an attempt to shift responsibility onto an unidentified third party. James Unick testified in his own defense. His testimony concluded on the 6th of February. In a reversal of his earlier denials to investigators, Unick acknowledged on the stand that he had met Sarah Ann Geer on the night of the 23rd of May, 1982, and that they had engaged in sexual contact. He denied causing her death. According to his testimony, Sarah approached him while he was playing a video game at the Cloverdale arcade, told him she was 16 years old, and suggested they go somewhere private. He testified that the contact between them was consensual, that it occurred near the Russian River, that Sarah was alive when they parted, and that he returned home by 11 that evening. He testified that he had not previously disclosed this account because he understood that sexual contact with a minor was unlawful. "I did not strangle anybody," Unick told the prosecution during cross-examination. The prosecution characterized this testimony as an attempt to suggest that an unidentified individual, one who left behind no forensic evidence whatsoever, was responsible for Sarah's death after Unick left the scene. Defense attorney Gabriel Quinnen argued in his closing statement that there was no evidence directly linking Unick's acknowledged encounter with Sarah to her death, and that the prosecution's case rested entirely on DNA evidence establishing contact, not on evidence establishing the cause of death. Quinnen told the jury that Unick was someone who, in his words, had been surprised because homicide simply did not happen in Cloverdale in 1982. Quinnen stated that Unick regretted not coming forward earlier and credited him for ultimately choosing to testify. On the 13th of February 2026, the jury returned its verdict after slightly more than 2 hours of deliberation. The date held particular significance. The 13th of February 2026 was Sarah Ann Geer's 57th birthday. The jury found James Oliver Unick guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also found true the special circumstance allegations connected to the commission of a lewd or lascivious act and the rape of a child. Observers in the courtroom were reported to have gasped and reacted audibly to the verdict. As the courtroom emptied following the proceedings, several attendees were reported to have said, collectively, "Happy birthday," in reference to Sarah. Sonoma County District Attorney Carla Rodriguez issued a public statement following the verdict. This guilty verdict is a testament to everyone who never gave up searching for Sarah's killer. This is the coldest case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury. While 44 years is too long to wait, justice has finally been served, both to Sarah's loved ones as well as her community. End quote. The Cloverdale Police Department also issued a statement expressing what it described as its deepest appreciation to the individuals and partner agencies whose persistence had culminated in the verdict. Under California law, a first-degree murder conviction, accompanied by a true finding on a sexual assault-related special circumstance, carries a mandatory sentence. The available sentences in such cases are life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, or, in jurisdictions and cases where prosecutors elect to pursue it, the death penalty. The Sonoma County District Attorney's Office did not pursue the death penalty in this case. A sentencing hearing was scheduled for the 23rd of April, 2026, before Judge Laura Passagia. Given the special circumstance finding returned by the jury, the legally mandated outcome of that hearing is a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The Sarah Ann Geer case illustrates several principles that have become central to modern cold case investigation in the United States. The first is the durability of properly preserved biological evidence. Material collected from a crime scene in 1982 remained viable for DNA profiling more than 2 decades later in 2003, and that profile remained probative more than 2 decades after that, in 2024. This outcome depended entirely on consistent evidence storage protocols maintained by the Cloverdale Police Department across more than 4 decades. The second is the specific limitation of conventional database searching. The 2003 DNA profile, despite being complete and viable, could not identify James Unick because he had no prior criminal record generating a profile anywhere in CODIS. A profile with no database match represents, in conventional investigative terms, a dead end, unless a different technique is applied. The third is the capability of investigative genetic genealogy to overcome that specific limitation. By searching not for the unknown contributor directly, but for his biological relatives who had voluntarily submitted DNA to genealogical platforms, investigators were able to narrow an unlimited population down to 4 specific candidates, and ultimately to 1. The fourth is the role of covert evidence collection in confirming an investigative lead. The discarded cigarette collected during FBI surveillance of Unick provided a confirmatory DNA sample without requiring a court order or alerting Unick to the investigation before sufficient evidence had been gathered to support an arrest. Together, these 4 elements, evidence preservation, the limits of conventional database searching, investigative genetic genealogy, and covert confirmation, represent the same operational model that has resolved a significant and growing number of cold cases across California in the years following the Golden State Killer identification in 2018. The Sarah Ann Geer case also illustrates a specific and increasingly common model in cold case resolution, the partnership between a smaller municipal police department and a private investigative specialist. The Cloverdale Police Department, serving a small Sonoma County community, did not have the in-house specialized capacity required to pursue a 4-decade-old case using investigative genetic genealogy on its own. The department's partnership with private investigator Kevin Kline, beginning in late 2019 and formalized through the 2021 reinvestigation, provided the dedicated, sustained investigative attention that a case of this complexity required. This model, smaller agencies partnering with private cold case specialists, often working alongside federal resources such as the FBI, has become an increasingly common approach for departments that recognize the value of revisiting unsolved cases but lack the internal staffing to dedicate to them on a sustained basis. The formal record of the case, as it stands following the jury's verdict on the 13th of February 2026, is as follows. On the 23rd of May 1982, Sarah Ann Geer, 13 years old, was killed in Cloverdale, California. She had been sexually assaulted. Her body was discovered the following morning behind an apartment building on Main Street. The Cloverdale Police Department opened a homicide investigation. Approximately 9 men were questioned. No suspect was identified. The case went cold. In 2003, a DNA profile was developed from biological evidence collected at the scene. The profile was entered into CODIS. No match was returned. The case remained cold for an additional 18 years. In July of 2021, the case was formally reopened. The Cloverdale Police Department, working with private investigator Kevin Kline and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, applied investigative genetic genealogy to the 2003 DNA profile. The analysis identified James Unick as one of 4 possible matches. A covertly collected cigarette confirmed the match through DNA comparison. James Oliver Unick was arrested on the 22nd of July, 2024, in Willows, California. He was charged with murder, rape, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under 14 by force. Following a preliminary hearing in January of 2025, the case proceeded to a month-long trial in Sonoma County Superior Court. Unick testified in his own defense, acknowledging contact with Sarah Ann Geer on the night of her death, but denying responsibility for her killing. On the 13th of February 2026, Sarah Ann Geer's 57th birthday, the jury found James Oliver Unick guilty of first-degree murder, with true findings on special circumstance allegations mandating a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Sentencing was scheduled for the 23rd of April 2026. Sarah Ann Geer was 13 years old. She left a friend's home on an ordinary Sunday evening in May of 1982 and did not return. For nearly 2 decades, no forensic tool existed capable of identifying who was responsible. For 18 years after that, a complete DNA profile sat in a national database, viable and waiting, connected to no name. It took a reopened investigation, a private investigator willing to commit years to a single case, federal genealogical analysis capable of identifying a suspect through his own relatives, and a single discarded cigarette to finally close the distance between 1982 and the truth. James Oliver Unick was arrested 42 years after Sarah Ann Geer's death. He was convicted 44 years after it, on what would have been her 57th birthday. That is what 4 decades of evidence preservation, investigative persistence, and forensic advancement looks like when it finally reaches a jury. If this case connected with you, please subscribe to True Crime Files Decoded for new cases every week. Like this video, it directly helps more people find these stories. And leave a comment below, what part of this investigation surprised you most? For the families who wait, and for the investigators and private specialists who keep working long after a case has gone quiet, this channel exists to document that the work continues, and that answers, however long they take, remain possible. Real cases, real evidence, decoded